Wonderful, thank you. Well, hi everyone. I am so excited to welcome you to today's virtual USA Gap Year Fair. We are thrilled to be hosting you this afternoon. Just a quick note before we get started, I wanted to remind you that while this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with registered participants, the provider info sessions following the webinar are not recorded. So definitely be sure to check those out so you don't miss any important content. Thanks, Drew. Well, thank you all again for joining us live and coming prepared with questions for Holly. I'm super excited for what we have in store for you today, and I wanted to just take a really quick minute to introduce myself so you know who's speaking at you. My name is Claire Ling, and I'm the Outreach and Events Coordinator for USA Gap Year Fairs and Go Overseas. You'll see in some of these photos here that I've taught abroad with Fulbright, advised international TOEFL trainees, and worked with Gap Year students in Costa Rica. So needless to say, gap years in international education is something I'm really passionate about, and I'm thrilled more than anything to be here with you today to help you achieve the gap year adventure of your dreams. My fantastic colleague Drew is joining us as well and helping out behind the scenes, manning the slides and dropping links throughout this webinar. Thank you so much, Drew. This event is hosted by Go Overseas, which you can think of as Yelp, but for meaningful travel experiences. On gooverseas.com, you can browse programs, read verified alumni reviews, and explore other resources such as articles, guides, and scholarships. If you're inspired today to take the leap and start planning your gap year, this is a really great place to do your research and find your best fit program. Before we really dive into the afternoon's core programming, just a quick overview of what to expect today. So we'll start off the event with a Gap Year 101 webinar given by the Gap Year Counselor Extraordinaire, Holly Bull of the Center for Interim Programs. Then you'll get to interact with Gap Year program providers during the actual virtual fair, and Holly and I will be in the Ask an Expert Help Center throughout in case you have any questions or want to continue the Gap Year 101 conversation. So speaking of Help Center, something I definitely want to highlight, which will be your best friend throughout the entire virtual fair, is the Attendee Hub, which we're dropping a link to right now. So please, please, please bookmark this page because this is going to be your home base for the entire virtual fair experience. You'll use the Zoom links inside the hub to access providers' info sessions and Q&As. If you ever lose your hub link, you can always find it in your Zoom reminder emails for this event. And before I introduce our amazing speaker for this afternoon, I wanted to take a really quick moment to share a few super helpful Gap links with you all to check out before, during, or after this event. So first up is our Gap Matcher tool. And you guys, I'm so excited about this one. I personally think it's the coolest thing and such a great resource for today. So the Gap Matcher is the official USA Gap Year Fair search tool designed to generate a list of personalized Gap Year program suggestions based on you, your individual interests, priorities, and goals. If you still aren't quite sure which programs you'll be checking out during the fair, I'd invite you to actually take the Gap Matcher now to get your own customized list of programs to visit today. Next up is survey time. And definitely pay attention here because it's a fun one. So here at USA Gap Year Fairs, we're always looking to improve our content and make Gap Year information as accessible as possible. So that being the case, we'd love to hear about your experience today. If you complete this quick survey within 24 hours of the event, you'll be entered for a chance to win $250. It's that simple. Finally, I'd encourage you all to visit the USA Gap Year Fair's landing page if you haven't done so already. There, you'll be able to register for more great Gap Year events like our new Gap Year Crash Course, more info on that to come, and find information on Gap Year articles and resources, like the $5,000 Gap Year Scholarship we'll be launching on March 1st. So definitely keep your eyes peeled there. All right, and with that, I'm finally going to go ahead and pass the mic over to who you've all been so patiently waiting for, our wonderful Gap Year counselor, Holly Bull of the Center for Interim Programs. Holly has been counseling students and adults through the Gap Year process for more than 30 years and has placed over 3,000 individuals in programs. She served on the board of directors of the Gap Year Association, has presented at numerous international education conferences, and has been an annual keynote speaker since the nationwide USA Gap Year Fairs began in 2007. We're so lucky to have her joining us today. Before Holly dives into it, I just want to remind everyone of that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit questions as you think of them, and we'll answer them at the end of our event. All right, without further ado, Holly, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Claire. And thank you, Drew, behind the scenes. And my thanks also to the USA Gap Year Fairs for inviting me to speak. As Claire said, I've been speaking at these since they started 14 plus years ago. And also thanks to Go Overseas for being the host of the fairs. I actually was part of a prototype Gap Year Fair in 1994 when I was doing my master's at Harvard. And it was actually some co-students and I were creating this fair for the people in the community at Harvard, but also the wider community. So I've been involved in promoting this for quite a long time. Next slide, please. And as Claire said, I'm the president of the Center for Interim Programs. We're the oldest independent gap year counseling organization in the US. We started in 1980 when nobody was talking gap year in the US. It took time, but there wasn't a lot of awareness or support. And we've worked with many, many students, mostly students, but actually all ages as well, over 8,000. I worked with over 3,000, as Claire mentioned. And we have a huge database of options that we're vetting all the time. All we do is gap year counseling, so sort of day in and day out. Next slide, please. And I've worn so many hats in this field. My father, when he started this company, was a teacher and a headmaster for many years. So we lived both in the US and abroad. So my brothers and I grew up traveling and living in different cultures. I took a gap year myself when he started the company in 1980. So I took a gap year before college and I took a gap year after my sophomore year. And these are the times when people most typically take gap time. And then I've been a gap year parent ×2 now. My stepdaughter took a gap year. She's 28 now. My daughter Leah is on a gap year right now. And she's 19 and said she's really glad she's not in college right at the moment. And I've run the program in Greece that I did during my first gap year. I ran their US office for a while. And then I've been obviously counseling for years and years. And the picture there is of me on my first gap year. In the fall of my gap year, I went off to Hawaii. My friends headed off to college. And I was going off to check out whether I wanted to be a marine biologist. So I spent 3 months scrubbing out shrimp tanks and working with these scientists and just got a good sense of the daily do of the work. And it took me a month or so before I thought, nah, I don't have the patience for this. This is not something I want to major in or do as work in the world. You know, good to know before heading to college and focusing on that. Next slide, please. So for me as a counselor, the reason why I love this work and still love this work is what I look at is this process shifting away from working from the outside in to working from the inside out. And that's really the core value because, you know, we're put in school at 5 or 6, we're typically expected to go to college. There's a lot of I have to, I ought to, I should, and you're responding to these directives coming at you from the outside. And with gap time, ideally, you're stepping back from that track, because it's sort of a mental track that we're on, the academic track, and you're just asking, who am I? You know, what am I doing on this planet? What am I interested in? And then I choose and own what I'm up to. And if you at 17, 18, or 19 can choose and create your life for a nice chunk of time, that's training you how to do that. And that's the beginning of personal power. It almost matters less what you do than the fact that you're choosing what you're up to. Now, having said that, obviously there are better options than others. And you know, that's my job as a counselor. But for the most part, you just trust going towards something that draws you. Next slide, please. So what is a gap year? You know, to my mind, it's just this chance to explore these interests and skills, but with intentionality. This is not a vacation year. This is not really a year off. This is a year where you're really focusing on trying to get a bead on what lights you up or not, ideally. And typically it is between high school and college. People take breaks from college as well. I call them the stepaways for a semester or a year. It should be called gap time because you don't have to take a gap year. And so typically it's 3 to 9 months, and it is very much a year on. You know, if people say, oh, you're taking a year off, or, oh, I'm taking time off, baloney. You know, you're so on, you have to be, because you're stepping into things that are really different from what you've done. And you tend to be very much alive, and that's sort of scary and exhilarating at the same time. Next, please. And in terms of who takes gap time, really, it's anyone who's interested. High school grads, college students, older, you know, our oldest gapper was 72. And all different types of learning styles, no experience required. You know, you could be terrible at something, who cares? You're not being graded typically. You don't have to be good at anything. You're just checking things out, and you're going to learn from everything. Next, please. So lots of benefits here. You know, you're automatically self-motivated when you're going towards something you want to do. It's kind of a no-brainer. And so I think, again, parents get to see students really picking up steam, picking up the reins in a way that they may not in school, some of them. it's also a period of time to rest and rejuvenate. I don't think a summer is enough time often for some of the students I see to kind of fill back up before they hit 4 more years or more of schooling. Because I see a lot of students who are just kind of depleted. And this past year or so has been really tough on them. So just having that downtime is really helpful. But engaged in things, you're not just not doing. And for me, this was a big one, the relevance of your studies to the world. By senior year, all I could think of was I go from math class to history to Spanish here. And these are integrated courses. And how do they relate to the world around me? So what's the relevance of all this stuff I've been cramming into my head all these years to the world? And when I was in Greece studying modern Greek language and history and poetry and literature for the second half of my first gap year, that was a great curriculum because everything I was studying did relate to what was around me. And I hit college with way more vigor because of that. I just hit the ground running, excited about learning again for its own sake. Students are also more financially aware after gap time because they're thinking about budgeting in a way that they may not in school. And everything you do during a gap year goes on a resume. You are front loading skills, in the world skills that are probably going to be more useful for you than most classes when you enter the work world. That's the reality. Companies often care less where you go to college or what your GPA is. I mean, they want to know if you can show up and do the work, and how you present yourself is different. That sort of proactive energy that gap year students pick up. It's pretty compelling. And then, college and career clarity, this is not the reason to take a gap year, but if you want to check out a particular major as I did and see if you like it or not, or work in the world that you might want to do or not, it's going to be really helpful. And then jobs post-college. Some of the things that you could do during gap time are like a half step into the work world. So, without all the pressure on you. And that's going to help you as you transition not only into college, but college into the work world beyond. And Samantha, my stepdaughter, is a good example because the last 3 months of her gap year, she was 19 doing an internship in Dublin for a little art co-op, a little startup company. And she did a really nice job in 3 months. He said, "Hey, Samantha, you could run this place. You're good at business." She's like, "I like business." Hard to deal with artists because they're not very organized, but that's okay. And then what she found, she said later, was she said, "I'm pretty sure I got my job with IBM right out of college based on that internship that I did at 19 in Ireland." She said, "That's what we talked about during the interview." And they said, "Samantha, you pretty much got this job because of your gap year." What she couldn't see in herself was just how she showed up as a human being was different. That sense of self-confidence. She wasn't trying to be anything. It just was there from having taken on these different experiences. And people pick that up about you almost as soon as they shake hands with you. So these things really do help you get jobs. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so how do gap year students perform in college? Here's the myth. They're going to lose academic momentum if they step away from formal studies, or maybe they're not going to go to college. It's going to derail them if they're thinking about college. And the reality is, on average, these students are performing at higher levels on a GPA level than non-gap year students. And it's very rare that somebody, if they're intending to go to college, gets derailed by a gap year. What you're more likely to see are students going directly from high school to college and stepping away, like a third of freshmen step away after that first year or even a semester. And that's not something people are paying attention to as much. High schools are trying to get their students into college. They're not necessarily checking to see if they're staying there. Whereas gap year students, with that breather and the rest, all the benefits I've talked about, they tend to really appreciate college and they do very well in college, and they don't take as much time in college. It's 4 years or fewer compared to the average, which is 5 or 6. Okay, next slide here. This is showing some of the data. This is older data, but it's pretty much the data, the results they were hearing from even more recent data. Bob Claggett was in Harvard admissions for years, dean of admission at Middlebury College for about 7 years. And I was on a lot of gap year panels with Bob. And when he got to Middlebury, he just started to track the GPAs of the gap year students. And the blue compared to the red, these are the GPAs of the gappers, several percentage points higher than their peers. Not a huge difference, but statistically significant. And these students typically hadn't done anything academic during their gap year. So even if you're a little rusty, you're not going to forget how to learn. And you tend to be doing better on that GPA level. The other thing Bob noticed at Middlebury is that the FEB admits, a disproportionate number of those FEB admits who just had the fall away were walking away with all the leadership awards at Middlebury. It's like, what's happening in 3 months, basically, that's making that change in them? And I put it to, it's all this that I've been talking about. They had to think more proactively. What do I do with my fall? And then practice that. And they took that proactive energy right into Middlebury. Next slide, please. Okay, so Bob ran the numbers for UNC Chapel Hill as well. Same results, even more dramatic. The light blue are the GPAs of the gap year students. Typically, they didn't do anything academic with their year, or not traditionally academic, and their GPAs are higher. And the next slide is Mark Hatch, who's in admissions at Colorado College, saying the same thing. First year GPAs are higher. Young men who take gap time are outperforming non-gap year female peers. So I was on a panel with Bob, and Bob and Mark actually at a big NACAC conference. And I was frantically scribbling that down at the time because nobody had actually said that young men are doing better at CC. And again, it just maturity and time and focus, all of that really helps these students. And he said these students are leaders on campus and they don't have the same behavioral issues and dramas, roommate issues don't derail them. They're not coming out of high school and home. And they finish college in 4 years or fewer, which is a great savings. And he said, we'd like to see 20% of our incoming freshman class have taken a gap year. I think they're about 12% now. They become a research hub for gap year, Colorado College, and looking at the levels of anxiety and depression coming down in gap year students. Anecdotally, I can tell you that's what we've been hearing for years. My child is happier, is a better student, all these things. The pressure is off. And this was interesting. They're looking at just the numbers of disciplinary incidents in college also reduced, especially among young men. Colorado College is also one of the first I've heard when Mark was talking. He said, if you apply to Colorado College, it's in your favor if you tell us that you've done a gap year or you want to take a gap year. It'll help you get in, he said. Basically, on every level, you're a better student for us. You make us look good. So most colleges, you just apply and ask for a deferral. But with CC, you want to tell them if you're thinking about a gap year. Next slide, please. I mentioned just the 4 years versus 6 years. So gap year students tend to finish in 4 years or fewer. They're really efficient students. They're not changing majors as much. They're not changing schools as much compared to non-gap year students taking 5 or 6 years on average. And if you look at the savings, like $30,000 potentially, if you have a public college out-of-state tuition for $76,000, you will not be spending that amount of money on a gap year typically. So you can have a very low-cost gap year and get the same benefits and be a more efficient student. Sometimes people don't realize this savings actually in college with gap year students. Okay, next slide. These are some of the universities that actually either run or support the gap year. So they have scholarship money. Princeton University has been running the mid-year program for quite a while, 42 students or so a year. It's like a Peace Corps year. You have to apply to Princeton, get into Princeton, and then apply for that bridge year program. Tufts has the 1+4 program, community service work. UNC Chapel Hill provides money for a group of gap year students every year. And then Florida State University, and then Duke is the most recent one, providing a nice chunk of change toward gap year, US or abroad. And most of this money is coming from alumni donors. So it's interesting that families are saying, hey, colleges, this is really a value. You need to offer this ideally to your students. Next, please. All right, so some of the potential pitfalls and challenges. Ideally, you don't want to force a gap year on students. It just belies the whole power of choosing. I find that if I have a student come in my office who doesn't want to do it, or parents are reluctant, they're often they don't realize what this is, the benefits, and it helps to just talk them through it. And often once students actually know what they could do, they turn toward it. But if somebody says, no, I absolutely don't want to do this, I think there's no point in pushing it on them. And you want to make sure that you're landing in options that are well run, so that you're not wasting time on a dud placement. Or it's nice to be as safe as you can be in this world. So do your due diligence on options. And then the year as a whole, often people are doing more than one thing. So you don't want too many gaps during your gap year. It doesn't mean you have to pack every moment, but you just want enough going on. Pretty much every negative review I've heard about students taking gap years, and I haven't seen that many of them, has to do with a student who actually didn't have enough to do during that year. So they spent time twiddling their thumbs at home, which is not fun or productive. So that's a really good red flag. And don't judge a gap year by that. The students who engage in things tend to have a marvelous time. Okay, so it does take work. There's definitely more moving parts. This is not a traditional path. So you may need more support and guidance, ask for it. And students are changing and plans are changing, totally normal. You might have a scenario laid out for the year, But by this fall, if you're a senior, you may completely shift direction because you've changed. So the gap year needs to adjust with you. And then in terms of cost, I'll run through the cost of programs. You do not have to bleed financially to have a great gap year. But people are looking at budgets and how do I afford this on top of college tuitions. Next slide, please. So here's what I hear from students. I don't want to get behind my high school class. Or am I going to be too old as a college freshman? What I always tell students is you're on a parallel track. Next, back please. So you're on it. Nope. Go back one, please. So you're on this parallel track. So your friends are going off to college or whatever they're doing. Ideally, you're going to land in the fall in something that connects you with a peer group, many of whom would be in college with you in a sense too. So you don't have to disconnect from your peers. And the reality is, based on all these benefits I've been talking about, you are so ahead of a lot of your high school, graduate class, and not that this is a competition, but by virtue of all these skills that you're garnering that are going to help you as you transition into the work world post-college. So even if you graduate a year later, you're graduating with this skill set in place already, and it makes it much easier for you. And I think sometimes people don't realize that amazing benefit down the line. When you land in college, after taking gap time, you are more mature. There's no question about it. You might look at some of your peers and say, what are you all doing? As I did when I landed in college, because your head's in a different place. But luckily, you're not so age-bound in college. So there are way more gappers in college. So you can find those kindred spirits, join clubs, meet the gap year students. You don't have to align yourself only with your freshman class. I've never had anybody say, Holly, I wish I hadn't done the gap year because I felt too old as a freshman. My stepdaughter said I was the go-to person in my dorm. She said I liked it. She thought it was a benefit. When I landed in college, I definitely felt like I wasn't run by the mob. I didn't have to fit in the same way. I think that's that personal power. You just do things you want to do. You take advantage of college and it's not running you. So benefits far outweigh any bit of a disjoint you might feel being a little older. Next slide, thank you. So these are now the programs. So when I say program, I separate them into these four main categories. The facilitated group programs are specifically set up for gap year students. They can run, as short as a month, but typically more like 2 to 3 months or a full year. And you're paying some overarching fee or tuition, it could be 17, 20,000 or so a semester, depending. And they might be either focused on outdoor adventure activities, like the picture in the far left, or they could be, moving around with a group of peers and leaders in Europe, focused on art history or studio art, or marine studies, getting scuba certified and learning about marine conservation issues, or just cultural study options where you're with a group and you're doing service work and homestays and adventure travel all woven together. Or it could be an academic program, but always with this peer group built in and lots of structure and support. These programs, in the face of COVID, last year in particular, were wonderful because they created many domestic options, because a lot of people like going out of the United States on the gap year. But so there were mainland US and Hawaii programs running that allowed students to quarantine in a small group, much easier to quarantine 10 to 12 students and leaders than, a freshman class in college. And then they were able to step into experiences. We had over 160 students out in the field. Most of them were doing hands-on things, not online, unless they chose to be online. And it was remarkably successful. We didn't know how it was going to be, but it worked really well. The next slide will be the second category. And these are the shorter skill-based intensives, 1 to 4 weeks. You pay a fee for them, but it's less. You may come away with a certification of some kind, or in a short period of time, you're coming away with a lot of information fast. So it could be, hey, I want to build a guitar, or I want to learn how to teach skiing or snowboarding or yoga, or get my wilderness CMT medical training, or you do a cooking intensive here, or learn how to run a recording studio, or filmmaking classes, writing intensives. These are a great category because you can either pull them into gap time, a gap year, or you can pull them into breaks in college. And when I work with people, because they've got me for life, I'm saying, be strategic, get at the things you might not normally be able to get during the gap year. And then you can weave these other interests, pick them off systematically, these other interests you have, right through college or even post-college. And you'll have a really good beat on who you are and what you want to get at or not, and a lot of skills. The third category, next slide, will be the urban internships. So this is a particular category of individual placements. You do pay for these a couple thousand, and then they place you in a city, typically abroad, where you're living in shared housing with fellow students or fellow interns, could be a range of ages, but you have a built-in social life. You have to cook for yourself, clean up after yourself, ideally, head out the door every day to your job-like placement. And that's all arranged for you. So you're launched into this sort of half step into the work world. And these can be in Europe, in Africa, in Argentina, even New Zealand, Australia, if they ever let us back in, and are well worth it to A, see, do I like this work? Do I like these people? And B, this is going on a resume. It's going to help me get jobs. There are two hybrid programs like the group and internship, one in the States, one in Israel. So you are with a group of gap year peers, you pay more for them, get more structured support, and they arrange internships for you. And the last slide on the programs will be the volunteer options. So these are much more low cost, all over the world, all different ages, all different lengths of time, more rural than urban. So you could be working on on board a tall ship. You could be working with animals, wild or domestic. You could be helping, coach or teach in classrooms with children, and or working on a farm or a ranch. Some of them are individual placements, or many of them are, but you're still around people. And then some of them you could be with a group of fellow volunteers. So if you like the idea of being part of a group program, but you don't have to pay a group fee, because these will give you housing and food in exchange for labor, it could be something like trail work in national parks or disaster relief work. So this keeps the cost of a gap year very manageable. And many students like to start with more structure and support. And then typically there's a natural progression to more and more independence as they go through the year. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here's what a year can look like. It obviously doesn't have to follow this blueprint, but you can see it pretty much follows a school calendar. People tend to do their own thing in the summer to work, to help pay for the year, travel, see family, friends, etc. And then in the fall, ideally, when people start to head out, you want to be off and doing something, whether it's a group program with lots of structure and support that fills the fall, or skill-based intensives or something to get you launched. A winter break at home, this is where people are sometimes reapplying to college, occasionally applying to college, but typically people have applied in senior year and deferred. And then, and it's not a guarantee, but boy, it puts you in a different bracket when colleges see your full senior year grades, ideally they're good ones, and then you can speak from part of your gap year, and you are a different student. They know that coming in the door. And then January through May, you've got a nice chunk of time here where you might be doing a combination of internships or the skill things or the volunteer work, a little bit more independent, as you go along. You can flip things around. I had students doing internships last fall independently. I had students doing skill-based intensives last fall, like the WEMT course, or volunteer work. So like I said, you don't have to follow this exact plan here. And then just work or independent travel. Free travel at the end of a gap year is a great way also to get a lot of good skills, because you have to initiate your life almost every moment. And again, it's all a skill. And then college or the workforce beyond. Next slide. Thanks. So when and how do you start planning a safe gap year? Ideally by spring of senior year, if not sooner. You can start mulling it over. Both my stepdaughter and daughter started filling out our interest sheet when they were about 6 or 7, just for the fun of it. I think it's great for students to know it's an option, whether they take one or not, but it's just out there. So, and then check college deferral requirements. College by college, some will say, fine, take your gap year, but don't garner credit, or here you can garner so much credit. If you have scholarships, financial aid, sometimes they can defer them, sometimes not. Sometimes they have to disperse it within that year. You do have this option to potentially reapply to college during a gap year. And that's an option that some people will take on. And then, I often recommend do a free brainstorming session with the gap year counselors that are out there. There are a number of us that offer this, and there's no obligation, but you'll get a more specific year tailored to what you want to do, and a picture of that. And that's really helpful. And certainly starting with just identifying your general interests or locations in the world you want to go, and trust that, lead from those core interests and match those with the options. Make sure your passport's updated. Typically you're traveling as a tourist, but you do need that updated passport, good 6 months beyond, ideally, whenever you get back from your gap year. And then medications, mental health supports, you want to make sure those are in place as well. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So I talked about the cost already. You can see with the options out there, there's a range of program costs. So it's actually rarer that students will do group programs through the whole gap year. So they might do like a splurge. This is what I find when I'm working with them, a splurge, and then, more independent or low cost options as they go along. It definitely helps for parents just sit down and say, hey, here's what we can comfortably or willing to put toward your gap year. And then the student learns how to budget, in that process. Many of the group programs offer scholarships or financial aid, so ask. Many of the gap year counselors will offer scholarship or aid. Ask. Don't be afraid to ask for help. All of us in this field really, I think, are quite dedicated, and we want to help people be able to do this. And then if you have 529 plans, sometimes people ask, can I use that for gap programs? And some of the programs are accredited. So you might be able to use the 529 money, even if you can't get the credit. But you could still attend the program using that money. And for some of the colleges, you might be able to garner a bit of credit. Ask everyone for presents, graduation presents, anything you can think of. Tell them you'll write a blog. Most people are living vicariously through students' gap years, so you can encourage them to help support your gap year, and then do that crowdfunding. And then, working during the year, I think is great, even if you don't have to. I pay for all the airfare during my year. Round trip Hawaii, round trip Greece, one program volunteer, one program splurge. Great for my parents who had 2 other students in college ahead of me. And then the cost, as I said, can range widely from 0 to 20,000. And some students will do work locally during a gap year. What you have to know about that is if you're home, it's going to be potentially harder because people are often away. So socially, it can be harder. Also, when we're home, we tend to regress. So at least for part of a gap year, I think it's great if you can get out the door and do something away from home, even if for the rest of the time you're working a local job, you're going to learn from that as well. So it's all valid. Okay, next slide. So I like this slide because it just gives you a sense of our Western lives. We're very linear and goal-oriented here. And this is our academic track and our gap year plan. And it seems awfully tidy, but the reality of our lives is down here. I mean, here's COVID. It's just the ups and the downs and the richness of life experience that you're accruing when you have time. I mean, most students don't realize, parents are drooling because if they didn't get to do this, they want to, but they can't. Students don't realize what a luxury it is to take time like this right now in your teens and 20s when you're not tied to much, to go and explore in this way. And all of these experiences, not being a tourist, you're going to have all your life. I draw on my 2 gap years. They're still vivid after all these years. And it's not just because I do this work. It's just given me these connecting points with people in random and interesting ways all my life. Okay, final slide here. Just for those of you who hopped on later, again, I'm Holly Bull. I'm an accredited gap year counselor. And all I do is gap year counseling here in Princeton, New Jersey. So if anybody wants to speak more specifically with me, just hop on my website. I'm going to be in the help center to answer any questions, depending on how much time we have now. So Claire's going to pick back up, and we'll see here. Thank you, Drew, for putting that in. We'll see if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, go and meet with the other programs. You have wonderful programs out there to chat with today, and just pop in and ask me any questions in that help center if you need to have them answered. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Holly. Goodness gracious, you are making me want to really take a gap year right now. This is just a quick reminder to everybody. We really want you to get the most out of your time here. So please, please, please throw those questions into the Q&A box. Here are just some quick screenshots for how to do that if you're tuning in from a mobile device or if you're tuning in from your computer. Really simple, just throw that question in. And Holly, I think I have a question just to get us started with this Q&A session. What would you say the benefits are when it comes to working with a gap year counselor instead of kind of going at it on your own?
That's a great question, a very nice question to ask. Thank you. I mean, you don't have to have a counselor to create a gap year, just obviously. And I think there are a lot of resources out there now, so people are engaged in that. I think the benefit of working with us counselors is that this is all we do. We're sort of in the swim of it day in, day out. We know the programs really well. We know what to tell parents not to worry about or what to tell the student not to worry about. Or we're helping, reassure parents and then saying to the student, go, go. And then all through a gap year, we're checking in periodically to help. So inevitably, people are changing as they go through this year, as I said before. So you don't want to be scrambling last minute to try and find something if you're, if you're changing or the world's changing. We had so much dynamic movement last year. And I think this year will be a little calmer, but who knows? So I think having the benefit of that person in your corner just talking you through it is really helpful. Absolutely.
Definitely. That's a great point. Thank you so much, Holly.
You're welcome.
Now it looks like we have a question in from Sarona. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Sarona has a really great question, which is, what about a child who has no idea what he wants to do, is barely making it across the finish line to high school, doesn't have a lot of motivation? Is a gap year a good idea for this student?
I think a gap year conversation is a great idea for that student. And part of our mission is just to educate people about this field. It's still a relatively young field in the States since we started here in 1980. Nobody was talking gap year at that point. Full swing in the UK, but really at its beginning stages here. So when you have a student who's just been in the school setting, they're not motivated there, more schooling is probably not going to be the answer right away. Having a conversation about what they could do during a gap year helps them concretize it. So rather than the abyss of a gap year, it's like, oh, wow, I want to do that maybe, or maybe I like that better than that. And they're just weighing these concrete options against each other. And then we map out a scenario for that year so they can see what it looks like and are reassured by that. But hearing concrete options, the options drive the engine for that student because they don't know what's out there. For many students, it's just like, okay, well, I got to go to college, or maybe I'm a dropout. Those aren't great choices, but if they can hear, no, I could go and, get trained as an EMT maybe, or let me try that out, without making a huge commitment to it. It's just trying stuff out. It's much more manageable for them, and they're not locked into anything. If I had to stay in Hawaii the whole of my gap year doing the marine bio stuff after saying, not this, it's like 3 months, okay, got that, let me go to Greece, and that was great to have those two main things during the year.
Fantastic. Well, I think that could be a good point for us to jump into.
You're welcome.
Of course. If anybody also, I want to say, if anybody has any other questions for Holly, or if you'd rather connect kind of in a more one-on-one manner, please do jump into that Ask an Expert Help Center. Both Holly and I will be there throughout this whole virtual fair. So we're more than happy to help answer any kind of questions that you have. So definitely we'll be there to continue this conversation, which is off to a really exciting start. So with that, I think, Drew, you can go ahead and share the screen again. Great. Thank you so much. So on that note, if you're looking for another way to connect with Holly and our other really amazing gap year experts and counselors, I'd encourage you all to register for our How to Take a Gap Year, the Ultimate Crash Course series. This crash course brings together expert gap year counselors and gap year alumni in an engaging series of panel style events with live Q&A. It's the perfect complement to this virtual fair, and you only need to pre-register once using the link that Drew just dropped in the chat to receive access to these 7 super informative events. Great. Okay, and now onwards to my final reminder of the afternoon, which is to utilize your attendee hub. So Drew is dropping the link to that hub one more time in the chat. And again, you'll use the Zoom links inside the hub to navigate into info sessions and Q&As of our fantastic lineup of gap year program providers. So without further ado, it's time to kick off the fair. This is your chance to connect with program providers. So I really recommend you unmute your mics and chat with the presenters. They're all really looking forward to meeting you. So thank you so much again for joining us today. And I hope that you all have a fabulous fair. I also selfishly hope to see many of you in the Ask an Expert Help Center with Holly and I too, if you get lost or if you just have more questions that you want to chat about. All right. Thank you, everybody.